All right. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on Zoom for the 2020 Student Research and Innovation Showcase. This event is proudly sponsored by our longstanding partner at Bull Fredrickson Intellectual Property Law. Keith, I see you there if you want to give a quick wave. I'm Jennifer Souter, WiSys's Director of Patents and Licensing. For those that aren't familiar with WiSys, we are a nonprofit supporting organization of the UW system. And at WiSys, we support research, we support ideas, we inspire students, and we build culture, all with the goal of really inspiring Wisconsin innovation. So on behalf of WiSys, we are delighted to be here today to feature student researchers and innovators from across the UW system, this live broadcast as part of our SPARK Symposium virtual series. So today you're going to be hearing from 15 groups of presenters from a variety of academic disciplines and technology sectors, as well as UW campuses. And in just a few moments, each presenter will be introduced to you to start their presentation. So to get the most out of your viewing experience today, we encourage you to use speaker view, and we ask that you please leave your audio and video turned off during the main presentation so that we can feature our presenters. As we have a full schedule today, we're unfortunately not going to be able to take Q&A after each presentation. However, you're encouraged to engage with presenters during the dedicated breakout session, which will take place directly after the oral presentations. So each of our breakouts are going to be moderated by UW campus leadership as well as WiSys team member. And this breakout session is really intended to provide an opportunity for attendees to engage in a collaborative discussion, as well as provide that opportunity for Q&A with the presenters themselves. So to help us get you into your breakout room today, please make sure that your name on the screen is showing as your full name. You can also rename yourself if you've not done it, and that will just make it a lot easier for us. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the following moderators who kindly donated their time today for the event. First up is Molly Gribb, College of Engineering, Mathematics, and Science from UW-Platteville. Give a wave, Molly, thank you. I've got Carmen Manning, Dean of the College of Education and Human Sciences at UW-Eau Claire. Carmen, I don't know if you're there with a quick video wave. Perfect. We also have Gary Wood, Vice Provost from UW-Parkside. And from our own team at WiSys, we have Ray French and Mike Sensi. So I really want to thank all of you for being here today and for your support of this event. I also want to thank all the faculty mentors that are supporting their students. We really appreciate your time, and thank you again for encouraging your students to take part in events such as this. Last but not least, I want to give a big thanks to our WiSys team that's here supporting our event. These events could not be made possible without you. So if I could ask everyone to turn their videos and audios off, we're going to get started with our presenters. And again, if you want to use speaker view, you should be able to view your students right here. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our first presenter, and that is Maria Arunkumar from UW. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maria Arunkumar, and I'm the founder of Build a Wedding. Build a Wedding solves the problem of information overload in couples planning their wedding, making the experience less stressful and more fun. Next slide. Thank you. So a little bit more about me. I am a senior at UWGB, and I'm also the co-founder and president of the Collegiate Entrepreneurship Organization on campus. Build a Wedding has been able to win quite a few competitions. One of the most recent ones was, it was one of the top 8 finalists in the Global CEO Pitch Competition, which had about 80 students pitch and 250 universities represented. Next. Okay. So if you've never experienced wedding planning before, you're likely to think that planning your wedding is a chill, fun, bonding activity with your significant other because, hey, you're great at decision making, you know yourself, and you have a very specific style, right? Wrong. Once you start scrolling through Pinterest and seeing the plethora of options available, you'll quickly realize you have no idea what you want. This is because there are a lot of decisions to be made. The venue, catering, photography, videography, lighting, sound, hair and makeup, table arrangements, decorations, entertainment, dress, and transportation. And each stage can be broken down into many more micro decisions. And for each decision, there are an endless number of options to choose from. So this can lead to couples feeling very stressed and overwhelmed. And I want to make the wedding planning experience fun and easy. Now, I know there is no way I can reduce the number of decisions to be made, but I can make the whole process less overwhelming. And that is exactly what Build a Wedding plans to do. So Build a Wedding guides you through a decision flow chart that follows a time schedule. So couples know exactly when and where to start, and they don't get distracted along the way. And at each stage, it guides you through a comprehensive set of questions to determine exactly what you need. Based on your answers, filters will automatically be set. And based on your filters, Build a Wedding will access the vendor's API to retrieve relevant data, providing you with a personalized set of options for available products and services that meet all your requirements. This way, you don't have to sift through 100 different sites with 1,000 different options. So Build a Wedding initially started out as an idea for a team of vendors, providing a one-stop wedding shopping experience for couples at my entrepreneurship class at UWGB. But upon receiving feedback from my classmates, I realized that the idea was A, not scalable, and B, the problem being addressed was not clear. So I pivoted and decided to focus on one problem: weddings being too expensive. I wanted Build a Wedding to be an app that connected couples to vendors. And I also wanted it to be a platform that made use of college students' talents. This way we can provide services at a more affordable rate to couples and provide college students with the opportunity to gain experience. However, when I presented the idea to the advisory board in the Light Up Lakeshore pitch competition, the judges were slightly skeptical because they felt that couples would not feel comfortable with the idea of non-professionals, as it might mean the quality is being compromised. So I had to go back to the drawing board, and I did more research, and I found out that another main complaint that couples had while planning their wedding was that they did not know what they wanted, and they were overwhelmed by the amount of options available. So instead of focusing on making the services cheaper, I decided to focus on streamlining the decision-making process and making the wedding planning experience more easier and less stressful. This new and improved idea was able to win the Light Up Lakeshore pitch competition, and it got a good response from the public. And with the same pitch, I entered the National CEO Pitch Conference, and seeing Build a Wedding be selected from 80 other pitches and progress to the semifinals was a huge green light for me. However, it was not able to progress to the finals, which I was slightly disappointed by. But I went back to look through the judges' comments, and one thing was consistent. It was with competitors like The Knot, Zola, and Wedding Wire, how was Build a Wedding going to be different? So on top of providing a step-by-step process, we needed another factor that clearly set apart Build a Wedding from its competitors. And that is exactly what we did. All right, so let's say you're looking for chairs for your reception. If you go onto the current wedding planning websites like Wedding Wire, they show you the different companies that rent out chairs in your area. So you would have to go click on the company, click on the website for that company, and then scroll through their entire catalog of chairs. Here's how we're different. We cut out the middleman. We bring you directly to the end result. So based on your theme, color scheme, and budget for your wedding, which we would have helped you predetermine, we go through the catalog of chairs in the different companies and provide you a list of chairs that will suit your needs. So instead of suggesting to you vendors, we suggest to you chairs from different vendors. The wedding industry is definitely growing. In just 1 year, it grew from $50 billion to $80 billion. And statistics show that 59% of Americans say that they will get married, and 29% of them have been married more than once. So there is definitely an opportunity here to be taken advantage of. And now is the right time to act. A market research reported that the revenue growth for wedding services industry is expected to decline in 2020 as many weddings are postponed due to the restrictions on large gatherings. However, it is expected to surge in the early outlook period because operators are accommodating both postponed and new weddings. So to be ready with a new product to accommodate the expected influx of weddings when the current situation has settled down will give us a huge competitive edge. And this is exactly what Build a Wedding plans to do. So by August, we're hoping to start creating the wireframes, and in 2 months, we'll start creating the prototype. This is a 6-month process. So after we've created the prototype, we will be using a few months to collect user feedback to see how Build a Wedding would perform in an actual market and to gather customer feedback. So based on the customer feedback, we would make changes to the design and functionality if necessary. And by November, the app will go live. So once the app is launched into the market, we'd focus our efforts on marketing as well as gaining a solid customer base. Finally, Build a Wedding is all about trying to make the wedding planning experience less stressful and more fun for couples all over the country so that brides and grooms can say, I do with confidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. That's great. All right, next up, we've got Joseph Crianza from UW-Platteville. Joseph?
Thank you. Good evening, my name is Joseph Crianza, and today I will be discussing the scope of essential oils for the control of soybean white mold disease. So in today's agroecosystems, several factors stipulate the success of a given crop. Currently, one of those factors, plant diseases, causes anywhere from 20 to 80% of crop loss in the field, with an additional roughly 10% loss due to post-harvest diseases. Now, up to this point, chemical control of diseases has been the most common management strategy, but this comes at an extreme cost. Wisconsin farmers invest roughly $23 million annually for the control of these diseases. Not to mention the economic impact, the development and use of synthetic fungicides cause detriment to the environment, as well as promote the development of fungicide-resistant pathogens. In the Midwest, white mold prevails as the dominant plant disease affecting soybeans. Now, essential oils have been used for thousands of years for various different purposes, including their role as antimicrobial agents. And testing the scope of essential oils as antifungal agents for the control of soybean white mold disease is a step for sustainable plant disease management in tomorrow's agriculture. So before the study was initiated, we decided to break our approach down into 3 stages. We began by identifying a concentration of essential oil that inhibited fungal growth on the plate through a growth inhibition assay. This starting point gave us an idea of the smallest concentration that would have an effect on inhibiting mold growth on the plate. Simultaneously, we initiated a phytotoxicity assay where we identified different concentrations of essential oils with the least phytotoxic effect. We did this to prevent plant detriment at the time of the oil application. Lastly, we aim to identify an essential oil that works best in a control and preventative strategy through a pathogenicity assay. To identify a concentration of essential oil that inhibits white mold growth, we utilized and initiated our study with a growth inhibition assay. This experiment utilizes a strategy known as poison food technique. We started by preparing fungal growth medium plates and treating them with 6 different essential oil treatments. White mold was then subcultured onto the treated plates and left in incubation for a week's time. As you can see on the pictures of the right, there are 2 different essential oil concentration treated plates, and you can see that there is even no mold growth even at 0.075% concentration. Our second step in the study was to identify concentrations of essential oil with the least phytotoxicity. We did this by utilizing a phytotoxicity assay in which we used 5 different essential oil concentrations to test the effects on soybean foliage. The soybeans were sprayed with different concentrations, left for 3 days, and then the phytotoxicity severity was scored. As you can see from the pictures, there are different phytotoxic effects for different concentrations of a particular essential oil. As you can also see, 0.075% concentration proved to be the least phytotoxic, in addition to also being effective in inhibiting white mold growth on the plate. Our final approach, to identify an essential oil that worked best in a control or preventative strategy, was utilized through a pathogenicity assay. Here, soybean seedling infection severity was scored in 2 different management practices. The first group of soybeans were inoculated with white mold first, rested for 3 days, then treated with essential oil to test the effects in a control strategy. The plants were then sitting for a week's time, and the disease severity was scored on the 7th day. The second group of soybeans were treated with essential oil first, then inoculated 3 days later to test the effects in a preventative situation. The plants also sat for a week's time, and the disease severity was scored on the 7th day. As you can see, the disease severity scores were significantly lower in the soybean seedlings that were treated under the prevention strategy comparative to that of the control strategy. So from these three approaches, we found several valuable pieces of information that can be utilized moving forward. Firstly, from the growth inhibition assay, we've learned that all 6 treatments have a growth inhibiting effect on the media at as low as 0.075% concentration. From the phytotoxicity assay, we learned that 0.75% essential oil concentration caused the least phytotoxicity to the soybean seedlings. Combining these results, we then tested the effects of the oils in a control and preventative strategy through a pathogenicity assay, and found a significant reduction in disease severity in plants tested with a preventative strategy. Moving forward with the project, testing lower concentration as well as more essential oils, eventually modifying essential oil compounds to have improved solubility and efficacy in plants, and gene expression study to identify the defense mechanisms triggered are all of relevance to our study. Essential oils have been used for thousands of years and now may be potentially used as a safe alternative to chemical fungicides in the control of plant diseases for a more sustainable future. Thank you, WiSys Foundation, for holding this virtual symposium in which I was able to present my research, along with my faculty advisor and friend, Dr. Muthu Venkateshwaran, my colleagues at Muthu Lab, and the Summer Undergraduate Scholarship Program at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville for giving me the opportunity to conduct my research this summer. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Next up, we have Aaron Ellefson and Kyler Monahan from UW-Eau Claire.
Hello, my name is Aaron Ellefson. I am a materials science major and senior at UW-Eau Claire.
And I am Kyler Monahan, a material science and engineering major at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Our co-author and collaborator at Mayo Clinic is Dr. Jeremy McBride, and our primary investigator at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire is Dr. Elizabeth Glogowski. While I start, I want to just mention one thing. Cancer will affect most of our lives. In fact, 2 in 5 people will develop cancer in their lifetime, and you may already know someone who has cancer. And if not, it is likely that someone you know will develop cancer. This is why the work that we are doing is so important. With the new materials that we are developing, we are working to decrease the complications and side effects of tumor ablation. During ablation, doctors use radio frequencies, burning and freezing to destroy tumorous cells. Some of the drawbacks of ablation include the fact that surrounding tissue can be harmed due to the lack of insulation on the target organ. Insulating the organ from the surroundings is very important, and isolating the organ is also an important thing to control. Current methods to do this include injecting water or CO2 into the body to insulate the organ from the surrounding tissue. Some issues with this include the fact that water can flow away from the tumor site and won't maintain contact with the organ. This leads to a need for a greater volume during surgery. Gas cannot be controlled as easily and can leave the cavity. To solve all of these problems, our research has been focused on developing an injectable foam. Our primary focus was to create a foam that remains in the tumor site and maintain contact with the target organ. We were trying to develop and improve the mechanical properties of this foam so that it can maintain contact for at least 1 hour. As you can see on the right side of the screen, Our foam that we are developing is on the left, while the standard foam is on the right. You can watch the collapse over time. We use small batches to test different additives and use different methods to test the stability of the foam.
These are the results of our project, which has defined stability as the foam holding up against weight over time. The baseline of the standard solution shows a gradual decrease in volume and therefore stability over the course of an hour. The essential data points are at 30 and 60 minutes, marked with a dashed vertical line. The baseline is shown in red and has a stability of 77% and 4% at the 30 and 60 minute marks respectively, showing almost total collapse. The foam with the primary additive in the solution is marked in blue and has a stability of 93% and 87% respectively. Collapse over time is important because the foam needs to last the duration of the surgery, yet degrade and disperse inside the body after the procedure is complete. The primary additive is over 20 times more stable on average, which shows significant change in the mechanical properties of the foam. The current process of enhancement leads toward a surgical grade foam that has the desired properties to make it a viable candidate during tumor treatment. Our continued research will focus on secondary additives to further increase the stability of the foam and improve patient recovery through greater comfort. We have already started investigating complementary characterization methods seen on the right. That's an image I took of our baseline using a BX51 light microscope at 20 times magnification. It is filtered to become a binary image to show the bubbles inside the matrix of the solution. An area of interest for data collection is the size and special density of the bubbles in the foam. The smaller the bubbles and the more they fill space, higher density, the more stable the foam. Biocompatibility is a crucial aspect for the overall performance of the foam. All materials selected are approved by the FDA. We want to investigate how the foam changes and interacts with bodily conditions such as temperature and enzymes. This time we'd like to acknowledge the Materials Science and Engineering Department and Center of UW Eau Claire for the lab space and equipment that we use. And our project is only possible through the collaborative Mayo Clinic and UWC student funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Tyler. All right, next up, we have William Hartnett from UW Eau Claire.
Hi, my name's Nate Hartnett. I'm a material science student from UW Eau Claire. The title of my work is Characterization of Damage Induced on Rebco Superconducting Tape by Mechanical Slitting. So, an introduction to superconductors. A superconductor is a material that can conduct electricity with no resistance. In other words, there's no loss of energy due to heat. And they're used to create strong magnetic fields. So superconductors are used in fusion reactors, which are the future of energy in the world because they're capable of producing limitless energy with basically no emissions. Rare earth barium copper oxide or REBCO superconductors are a specific type of superconductor that are comprised of several layers. And if you look at the bottom right image, that's a picture of a fusion reactor that's designed using REBCO coils, or REBCO coils. So the motivation for our work, so REBCO superconductors are superior to any other superconducting wire because they have better superconducting properties. If you look at the top right graph, you can see the top two data sets, UH R&D short tape and SPI commercial tape, are both REBCO superconductors, and they're above all of the other competing superconductors. So that sounds great and all, but what's the downside of them? Well, the downside is that they're pretty mechanically frail and they're prone to delamination. So you may ask, why do they delaminate? Well, when they're produced, they're cut by a mechanical slitter, and this causes cracking on the edges, and then those cracks can initiate delamination. So in this study, we're investigating the formation of those cracks based on the geometry of the slitter. So the samples provided to us were fabricated as 12 millimeter wide wires, and then they were slit by superpower into 6 2mm wires. If you look at the top right diagram, you can see the sort of copper colored wider wire being slit into 6 different shorter ribbons or less wide ribbons. And then you can also see how we labeled ours based on number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We used scanning electron microscopy, or SEM, and confocal laser microscopy for this study. The SEM was used for mostly qualitative analysis, just to see what was going on. And then we used the confocal microscope for digital image analysis to measure the fracturing we see. So looking at all the edges of the samples, we noticed 2 different damage patterns, as you can see on the bottom right 2 images. The narrow damage, where none of the Rebco layer was fractured off, and the wide damage, where, as you can see, the whiter layer is the Rebco, and then the darker part is where the Rebco is fractured off because of slitting. And those were called narrow and wide damage. So from the SEM images, we noticed that all of the odd samples, so 1, 3, and 5, as you can see on the top right figure, showed wide damage, and the even samples showed narrow damage. This is also confirmed with digital image analysis, where we measured the length of the fracturing in each sample, and you can see that in the bottom left graph. So the y-axis is the fracture length, and the x-axis is the sample number. So the blue ones all showed high fracture lengths, and the green ones showed low fracture lengths. So the odd even trend, we believe that is due to whether the Rebco layer is in tension or compression. I guess first I should have you take notice to the schematic provided on top right. So this is what the Rebco wire looks like, all of its layers. Most important layers for this study are the black layer, which is the superconducting layer, and the silvery, the silvery thicker layer, which is the Hastelloy layer, and basically that's the backbone of the superconductor. So if you look at below the two images below that, in the even samples, the wires are being bent. So the black arrows are representing the blades of the slitter, and it's pushing each side of it up so that the bottom of the conductor is in tension and the top is in compression. So the bottom layer, which is the Hastelloy layer or the backbone layer, is in tension, and then the Rebco layer is in compression for the even samples, and vice versa. And when the Rebco layer is in tension, that's when the wide damage was occurring. So then to validate our results, we did the exact same study, but we flipped the conductor when it was being slitted. So the Rebco layer was on the bottom when it was being slitted. So for the even samples, that would mean that it's in tension. So we would expect the even samples to show wide damage instead of the odd samples, and that is what we observed, which is a pretty significant result. And it means that we can control the damage produced during slitting if we can control the strain state of the Rebco during slitting. So in our future work, we'd like to continue to work with Superpower to develop a new method for slitting and then test that method with the same study. So I'd like to thank Matt Jewell for letting me do research with him, Javier Ramirez for collecting some of the data and working with me, Yifei Zhang from Superpower for providing the samples and working with us. And this study was funded by DOE and Department of Energy and NSF. And then I'd also like to thank the Materials Science and Engineering Center at Eau Claire for letting us use their instrumentation. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Nate. That's great. All right, next up we have Molly Hennig from UW Oshkosh.
All right, thank you. The artistry and responsibility of a classical musician is to perform past works of music in a new and innovative way, so as to preserve past art as the foundation for creating new art. This, however, becomes difficult when a piece's message at its conception conflicts with today's standards on what message is appropriate to send to an audience. I faced this challenge with Robert Schumann's Frauenliebe und Leben of 1840, translated commonly as A Woman's Life and Love. Though singers still perform this song cycle today, there's been a great debate over this setting of Adelbert von Camiso's text, as well as its questionable representation of gender roles, specifically between that of a wife and a husband. The protagonist of the cycle is a young woman who is devoted to her husband, and the cycle's narrative is her feelings towards him throughout their engagement, marriage, parenthood, and finally his death. The cycle emphasizes the woman's apparent enthusiasm in being subservient to the husband with lines such as Ich will in deinen ihn leben, which means I shall serve him, live for him, and Lass mich in Demut, lass mich verniegen dem Herrn mein, which means let me in humility bow before my Lord. In concern of today's standards of gender equity in marriage, there are feminist scholars and performers who believe this text to be harmful for the progression of the arts, and so they hesitate to perform this piece altogether, according to Alyssa S. Goralnik. As my mentor, Dr. Hersey, and I planned my summer research of this piece, my musicologist professor, Dr. Julia Chabowski, presented this issue of Frauenliebe und Leben's text to me, and she provided a solution. After researching the lives and relationship of the composer, Dr. Robert Schumann, and his wife, the pianist Clara Robert Schumann. After researching their relationship, I was to research several different interpretations of the cycle's central message. After that, I would compare and contrast several recorded performances of the cycle. Then I could deduce whether a creative flexibility for this cycle's emotional delivery was A, possible, and B, utilized in the past. I was very pleased to find out that this flexibility did indeed exist. The current scholarly analysis of this cycle indicates several differing opinions on its central message, all of which may be used as reference when developing the emotional core of the cycle's performance. To musicologist Ruth Soley in her article, Whose Life? The Gendered Self in Schumann's Frauenliebe songs, the cycle is meant to perpetuate expectations for women in that culture, using powerful mythic images of women and marriage, and specifically by making the woman present herself as docile and immobile under the male gaze. Christina Muxfeld's article, Frauenliebe und Leben Now and Then, remarks that the cycle is a step towards a more accurate representation of a feminine character, in that the woman is the emotionally dynamic teller of her own story, rather than a static and elevated vessel for a greater message, which was popular at the time. Alyssa S. Goralnik, in her writing, Ah, Clara, I Am Not Worthy of Your Love, interprets that the cycle is a conversation between Robert Schumann and Clara Schumann, the piano representing the husband's voice and the voice representing the wife's. Schumann was about to get married to Clara at the time, and according to Goralnik, he was met with a fear that he would be incompetent as a husband to Clara. And so he may have translated his and Clara's impending marriage dialogue into this music. Keeping the analyses of Muxfeld, Soley, and Goralnik in mind, there are three common interpretations of the cycle that emerge. One represents the specific emotional experience of the protagonist. One highlights the piece's misogyny and its outline of the ideal woman. And then finally, one narrates Schumann's perspective on his married life. Julia Culp, arguably the first singer to record the piece in 1910 with Otto Beck, emphasizes youth and emotional extremes in her performance. She incorporates a library of feeling from giddy exclamations of love to melodramatic mourning. This is a specific personality for Culp to examine, an immature, youthful one. And so it falls in line with the interpretation of this being a woman's individual experience. Jessie Norman's recording in 1987 with Irwin Gage sets itself apart from past performances of the piece with her highly disciplined restraint. Jessie Norman's protagonist is subdued and withheld, finding the character's circumstances within her emotional control. In this way, Norman's portrayal agrees with Schumann's perspective of Clara as the controlled and serious but deeply caring individual that she was. Finally, Tim Ashley of The Guardian calls Anna Sophie von Otter's recording in 1996 with Bengt Forsberg radical and unearthing a layer of emotional wildness beneath the song's surface. Von Otter is unafraid to show mental trauma in her character's dialogue. Her version of a woman is permanently damaged by the man she loves and by the role she had to fulfill, which lines up with Soli's vision of a woman who is trapped within a patriarchal society. These recordings each represent a possible interpretation of Frauenliebe und Leben, implying a potential creativity and flexibility to its text and music. The message within the modern retelling of the cycle remains up to the performer, and it is necessary to understand the alternate viewpoints of the cycle's text so as to map out how one's own version of the story will go. In my case, I was able to form my own narrative when performing the piece, which is that of a young artist, not unlike Clara Schumann, a woman who loves her husband very much, but resists the societal expectations she's expected to follow. Frauenliebe und Leben, therefore, is an example of how classical vocal music can last from 1840 to today. The ability to develop one's own creative interpretation of a narrative depends on the singer's personal choices in how to effectively and emotionally deliver the text. And this allows a piece such as this cycle to resist time's erosive nature, as well as bring a new version of the story, of a simple story, of a woman whose heart is broken. This project would not have been possible without the following people. Thank you, Dr. Anna Hersey, my voice teacher and my mentor for this project, Dr. Richard DeCamp, who edited my personal translation of the cycle, Dr. Julia Chabowski, who provided feedback and inspired the thesis for this project, Dr. Ellie Coleman, who guided my pianist and me through the cycle's rehearsal, Joshua Kriegel, my collaborator and pianist for the cycle's performance, Deb McKenzie, my initial rehearsal pianist, Dr. Linnea Anderson for providing biographical resources on Clara and Robert Schumann. I would also like to add a thank you to the UW-Oshkosh Office of Scholarship and Creative Activity for funding my research. And then finally, thank you to all of you for your interest in the evolution of classical performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. That's great. All right, next up we have Esther Janinga and Gabrielle Lewis from UW-Whitewater.
Hello, our project is to develop a series of sensors and with a computer to monitor landslide activity. I'm Gabriel Lewis, and I am a third semester undergraduate at UW-Whitewater, and I am studying physics with an emphasis on engineering.
Hi, I'm Esther Jenninga. I'm a third semester undergraduate student at the University of Wisconsin, and I am studying physics with an education emphasis. So a landslide is the falling or sliding of loose rocks or soil due to gravity. They lead to billions of dollars in property damage as well as the tragic loss of life. There is not a reliable method of monitoring landslide triggers as well as risks, and this problem exists in not only a local area such as the coast of Lake Michigan on the Wisconsin side, but it's a global problem as well. And so we are hoping that through focus we can develop a prototype instrument that is capable of detecting landslide triggers such as an excessive amount of water due to rainfall or water flow, but also through a freeze-thaw cycle, and that our prototype could also cause risk analysis.
So one of the ways we're trying to test for this freeze-thaw and all of these factors that you mentioned is preliminarily, we're starting with temperature and moisture. So some of the sensors you can see we're using, if you look at the top left, you can, or in the top right too, you can see we have the capacitive moisture sensors and digital temperature sensors. These are handy because they give us exactly what we're looking for here. I hooked them up to a Raspberry Pi 3, which is a small computer, small but powerful, and it does the job for what we need to do, and that's what we need as far as power consumption needs. But one of the ways we're testing out of the gate here for this freeze-thaw cycle that we're looking for here is by doing sandbox testing, which is very handy. So what we've done is we've put cold spots, which are, if you look at the bottom image, bottom center, we have 2 cold spots on our image there. And we have put the sensors in an array around those cold spots further and closer to them with 2 on either side of the wings, left and right, two saturated bits of sand on either side, and we're seeing how that water is moving towards those spots. What we're looking for is we're looking to see how, if those cold spots are drawing moisture to them, and specifically, if they're pulling it, further to them or closer away, or further away. So that's the idea, and what we found so far seems to indicate just such.
So on the bottom right of your screen, there is a FLIR image. It is thermal imaging of our sandbox, specifically close-up of our cold spots, which you can see in the dark purple, blue, and then the yellow-orange area is the warmer parts, which would be insulated through our use of sand. This can also be seen in our graphs on the left side of our screen. The top is our four capacitive moisture sensors, with the orange line being one of the sensors placed towards the cold spots. The bottom graph is our 8 digital temperature sensors in Celsius. You can see within the first roughly 10 minutes of the temperature graph that there is a massive dip. This is when we added our liquid nitrogen soaked granite to the sand. This is to simulate a freeze-thaw cycle in Wisconsin. So the dip going down would be when the ground freezes, and as it gradually warms up would indicate our thaw. The gradual increase in temperature corresponds with the dip in the decline of the orange line in our top graph, which is indicative of an increase in saturation of moisture by the sensors. So our sensors, or the capacitive moisture sensors, read with a high number indicating a low level of saturation and a low number indicating a high level of saturation. So we hope that this preliminary data can be replicated in future experiments, as well as expanded when we move to the field with our research.
Now, we have done some preliminary field testing before, and that was mostly just to get our bearings, testing durability, how well is this being able to be deployed, is it being able to be deployed headless. So we've done a fair bit of stuff already out in the field. So one of the things we've done is we've taken plastic totes out into the field, and we've tested the durability of our system. One of the things we noticed early on was overheating of components, because the Raspberry Pi has an automatic protocol in there, so if the electronics heat up to a certain extent, the Raspberry Pi will automatically shut down. And this is bad for a number of reasons, the main one being that we are losing data when they shut down like that. So one of the first solutions we did was the box that you can see in the center and on the left, which are one of our lovely mentors made and is rather proud of. So he put the vents on that box and has one on the bottom and on the top, and airflow is allowed to move through those vents. And we also have on the back side of a little outlet, so we can run the wires through and out of the box so that they can be placed out on the ground nearby and easily deployed from the box. That's one of our big things, is trying to make it field deployable so we can just pick it up and go. And that's really one of our big things. Now, what's interesting about that box is that we have our phase 2 computer in there, and we've been moving forward with a lot of testing. And what we've done with the phase 2 is we've put a Pi plate on, which is an extension of the Raspberry Pi, which allows us to add more sensors onto it. And into this Pi plate, we have added ultrasonic sensors, which measure distance, which are hoping to measure sliding motion. And we also have a GPS on there. We've most recently added the GPS so we get a time fix and a position fix. This is really important for us because we need to know exactly when things are happening. We want an exact time fix on when events occur. And that's really big. So apart from the power consumption, durability, that's what we've done out in the field so far.
So currently most of our experiments are done in sandbox in a lab in a controlled setting. This is so that we can know for sure what variables are affecting the movement of water, and we hope to see more in our experiments that the water is drawn to cold spots, which can make slopes unstable. For future work, we hope that we can add more of those stackable plates that Gabe mentioned earlier to our Raspberry Pis, so that we can add not only more sensors, but decrease the number of Raspberry Pis we have to deploy into the field. We're also hoping that we can make the Raspberry Pis not only communicate with each other, but with us remotely, which he mentioned the word headless. It means that the Raspberry Pis work without a computer monitor or running on a network that is in a school system. This, we're hoping, can make us able to connect to our Raspberry Pis and collect data through a cellular module rather than connect through a system computer. The sensor modules are helpful in monitoring landside triggers, and they're also useful in allowing us to perform risk assessment on other geological hazards. We're also hoping that our prototype can be used in farmlands for monitoring water flow.
So we in the project would like to acknowledge our mentors and all of the other wonderful people who've helped us financially and just physically through supporting this project. So that would be the undergraduate research program for offering Esther and I positions in this, and all of the people who've given us money to help us make this through. And I'd also be ashamed if I didn't mention Nick, Anya, and Ryan. They have all done fantastic work helping us to get to the point where we are. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Esther Gabriel. All right, next up we have Emily Colby.
So thank you for that introduction, and I'm Emily Colby, and I'm a horticulture major at the University of Wisconsin River Falls, and I'm conducting research this summer in conjunction with Dr. David Zlezak, who is my advisor, and we are conducting research on the determination of Rosa hybrida floral part counts based on time of season and flower number. So to introduce my topic, so the real reason why I chose this topic is because after I finish my bachelor's degree, I plan to go on to graduate school to major in breeding and genetics, and eventually after that go on to a career in ornamental flower breeding. And so this topic really starts to set the stage for answering a crucial question, which is how the effect of the season and just nature in general affects the flower formation and just the flower part in general of flowers that are planted out in the landscape. So a little bit of background information for those of you who don't almost have a bachelor's degree in plants. So for this project, I'm counting the petals, which everyone knows, of course, the anthers, which is the top of the stamen or the male reproductive part of a flower, as well as the pistils, which is the primary female reproductive part of a flower. And I'm seeing the determination of the difference between those three components between the primary flower, which is usually the largest, first to open, as well as the secondary flower, which branches off of the primary flower, and the tertiary flower, which branches off of the secondary flower in the clusters that are formed when roses bloom. So the hypothesis for my project is that as the time of season progresses, the difference between the petals, anthers, and pistils counts between the primary, secondary, and tertiary buds will become more significantly separated in the flowers. So the research design is primarily to aid future rose breeders and floriculturists, since there really isn't a lot of information on this topic currently. And also the design is to project the pattern of flower size and pollen viability throughout the flowering season. And for those of you who may be concerned with the photo, that is actually a blown up picture under a microscope of viable rose pollen, which may look very similar to a certain pest that we're trying to avoid, but I can promise you that it's completely harmless. So currently, since my research is in progress right now, I have collected the first of 3 data selections from the season, and I'm doing my data collections on 5 different varieties of Rosa hybrida. These are roses that are grown naturally in the landscape at the Lindale Park Rose Garden in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the 5 varieties that I'm choosing to do my work on is Cherry Frost, Polar Express, Carefree Beauty, and Kiss Me, which are for Floribunda roses. And the 5th variety is Sven, which is a polyantha rose. And the reason why I chose these 5 is because they have a diverse genetic background, as well as flowering in that cluster formation, which you can see in several of the photos. And throughout my research, I'm doing 5 repetitions of each of the varieties to make sure that I have a variety of data collections. So far, since I've only taken 1/3 of my research collections, I can't really say anything on my hypothesis being correct or not as of yet. And so I will be collecting the mid-season and late-season data collections as the summer progresses. And so what I will be doing with those collections is interpreting the data and seeing if it will prove or disprove my hypothesis. And really what I'm looking for as far as the data interpretation is the graph you see above on the slide, which is the pistil count from Carefree Beauty from my first data collection, in which you can see on the box and whisker plots, the X's show the average number of the pistils as the flower count increases from the first to the second and increasing seconds from the left to right. And you see that there's that nice downward sweeping curve, and that's really what I'm looking for to prove my hypothesis. So to conclude, this research will help to aid future horticulturists and floriculturists. And this data will also help to predict the viability of pollen and the size of flowers as the season progresses from the beginning to middle to end. And will my hypothesis be correct? That is as to yet be determined. So I'd like to acknowledge the UW River Falls McNair program for funding my research this summer. I would also like to thank Dr. David Zlizak for advising me in my research and also helping me to think of the idea. I would like to thank the Lindale Park Rose Garden for allowing me to use their landscape roses for my data collection. And finally, I would like to thank the WiSys SPARK Symposium and all of you who are here today for allowing me to present my research to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emily. That's great. All right, next up, we've got Chris Cott, Zachary Meyer, Lincoln Schroeder, and Nicholas Teed from UW-Platteville.
Hello, I'm Chris Cott.
I'm Zachary Meyer.
I'm Lincoln Schrader.
I'm Nick Teed.
And today we are presenting on our research topic, applying counterfactual inference using predictive models to determine alternative course sequences for helpable students. Advanced slide.
About half of all students in the computer science and software engineering department struggle at some point in their academic career. These struggling students have a GPA of less than 2.0 or receive less than a C- in a course. Students and advisors have a hard time trying to figure out the best course of actions to help these students succeed. Our research questions are there common course sequences between students? Can we determine possible alternative sequences? How accurately can we predict alternate course sequence grades? And how many struggling students are helpable? A student is considered helpable if we predict a GPA improvement through course sequence intervention. Advanced slide.
For our research, we use a data set of past students who were in the CS/SC program between 2013 and 2018. And we wanted to see if students would do better on a different course sequence by applying counterfactual inference. Counterfactual inference is when you want to see what would happen rather than what did happen. An example is what would happen if a software engineering major changed to a computer technology course sequence. We would not be able to use a randomized control experiment, as we cannot go back in time to change a student's course sequence to view how they would have done. Therefore, we used predictive models to determine the grades of the students on the alternative path. Since both course sequences have common courses, we can use those to base our predictions for how they would have done. Some of the predictive models we used were new support vector regressor, Bayesian network, and random forest regressor. For these models, we could train on the course grades of all computer technology students prior to the course sequence divergence, then test on the software engineering students whom were dismissed.
For our results, of the original 349 struggling students in our dataset, we found that 146 students never graduated or switched majors. Of those students, only 17 of them were eligible for switching majors, and only 14 had enough data to be used in our predicted models. For a student to be eligible, they must have passed a minimum course requirement to start another course path. For example, Object-Oriented Programming and Data Structures is a course required for all CSSE majors. So if a student did not pass that course, they wouldn't be eligible for any alternate paths. Students who were only at the university for 1 or 2 semesters are also not eligible due to lack of data. Our results showed that switching to computer information systems is highly effective for struggling students, but switching from software engineering to computer technology is a less effective switch. All 14 of the students we tested were predicted to graduate with a GPA greater than 2.0 on the alternate path given.
The bottom images show the performances of our chosen grade prediction models. Our chosen models include new support vector regressor, random forest regressor, gradient boosted trees regressor and classifier, logistic regression, and a customized Bayesian network created by Nick, as well as 2 0R baseline models for comparison. 0R means zero rules, and it does not predict on any of the features, which is why they are used as a baseline. On the bottom left is our error chart. Normalized root mean square error, or NRMSE, is our primary evaluation metric. It is calculated on a 0 to 1 scale, with lower numbers being better. On the bottom right, we have our accuracy chart. We analyzed each model on a plain prediction accuracy, accuracy within a half grade, for example, a B prediction within B plus to B minus, and accuracy within a full grade, for example, a B prediction within A to C. As you can see on both charts, new SVR and random forest regressor performed the best at an almost tie, followed very closely by our noisy average Bayesian network.
We made a diagram that we can pull up here. And this diagram represents all the common courses we found in our data set, with the thickness of the lines representing how many students took that path. We also found that using this chart, we can determine alternate course sequences for students, but only if they were already following one of the paths listed. The models used can usually predict within full letter grade accuracy around 85 to 90% of the time. And for our conclusion, for the struggling students that are helpable, we haven't fully tested all struggling students, but we found that almost 10% of dismissed students are helpable and could potentially see a final GPA of 1.0, increase of 1.0.
For future work, we want to see if adding non-prereq courses to our models can help get more accurate predictions, look into how course retakes can affect our predictions, and look for course sequences that can reduce time to graduate. We also want to create a recommender system that builds on last summer's system that advisors can use to help real students.
We would like to acknowledge funding from the following sources: the UW-Platteville Summer Undergraduate Scholars Program, the UW-Platteville College of EMS, the UW-Platteville Scholarly Activity Improvement Fund, and the UW-Platteville Computer Science and Software Engineering Department. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's great. All right, next up, I'd like you to welcome Garrett Larson from UW-Platteville.
Thank you. Today I'll be discussing a strategy to identify new symbiotic genes in the model legume Medicago trincata. Below our feet lies a world of plant beneficial microorganisms like mycorrhizal fungi and nitrogen-fixing rhizobia. These microorganisms help a plant meet its required nutrients of phosphorus and nitrogen. While mycorrhizal fungi associations are prevalent among the majority of land plants, nitrogen-fixing rhizobia is limited to legumes. Symbiotic associations begin when signals are released in the soil and perceived by receptors, initiating a common signaling pathway in plants that activates known symbiotic genes. These genes are known as DMI2, DMI1, and DMI3, which stands for does not make infections, and they play a role in what is called early nodulin. Now, down the pathway, early nodulin is expressed, and I'll be referring to this gene as E-NOD11. The final response to the signaling pathway is nodulation and arbuscular mycorrhization. Now, since both of these share the common signaling pathway, and this pathway is conserved in majority of land plants, and it opens this exciting possibility of manipulating this pathway into non-legumes. However, currently there are gaps in our understanding of the common signaling pathway. In addition, a classical mutagenesis-based forward approach is saturated, meaning that we are no longer finding new symbiotic genes from this approach. In response to this problem, we aim to utilize and optimize a genetic strategy known as suppressor screening to identify novel genes in the model legume Medicago trincata, which is very similar, close relative to alfalfa. After identification, we aim to characterize the regulators of known symbiotic genes to connect the missing links in the common signaling path. Above here is a picture of Medicago nodules that show the phenotype NOD+. In a classical forward genetic approach, we take wild-type plants that show that phenotype, NOD+, which means that the genes are always turned on for nodulation. We then mutagenize and screen that mutant population, and from that screening, we isolate NOD- phenotype mutants. In contrast, for genetic suppressor screening, we take symbiosis defective mutants that are non-minus, mutagenize them, and screen that mutant population. And from that screening, we isolate non-plus mutants, also known as suppressors. And in both of these approaches, it ends in further characterization of mutants. Below is a depiction of our research design that we developed and optimized for the genetic suppressor screening. We started with seed extraction and sterilization to get rid of any contaminants. We then began to germinate the seeds on agar plates, and one day after germination, the seeds were planted in a tray of turfase, which is a soilless media, and it's very similar to what you find in the inside of a baseball diamond. 10 days after planting, we inoculate with rhizobia to induce nodulation, and 5 days after that, we inoculate again with rhizobia to target the E011 expression. In total, 17 days after planting, we remove the roots from the tray of turfase and screen both for E011 expression and nodulation as well. And this is done both through a colorimetric assay as well as a nodulation assay. In the previous slide, I mentioned two phenotypes that we screened for, nodulation and E011 expression. In this picture below, you can see those two phenotypes mentioned. We have nodules on the left side and E011 expression on the right side. Above is a summary of my screening data. This is an ongoing project that many students have worked on. In total, we've screened 25,000, 22,000, and 23,000 mutagenized seeds for genes DMI 1, 2, and 3 respectively. My contribution is solely to DMI 3, where I've screened a total of 6,000 seeds and found 11 putative suppressors for E011 expression and 2 putative suppressors for nodulation. With our results in mind, our next steps and what we're currently doing is confirming those suppressor phenotypes that we found in the M3 progeny. We would also like to do a series of genetic inheritance and tests, aliasm tests, and a detailed phenotype characterization. In addition, genetic mapping of the suppressor loci and next-gen genomic sequencing is in the future. To conclude, understanding the mechanisms behind the signaling pathway will help identify potential targets to engineer more efficient nitrogen-fixing associations in crops that currently don't benefit from these interactions. It is important to note that our efforts have the capability of increasing the sustainability of agriculture, reducing environmental effects from nitrogen application, and decreasing the costs incurred by farmers towards the purchase of fertilizer. I would finally like to acknowledge and thank my mentor, Dr. Muthu Venkateshwaran, and Muthu Lab members, as well as thanking the WiSys Foundation for allowing me to present my research here at this virtual symposium. I'd also like to thank all the listeners for allowing me to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Garrett. That's great. All right, next up we have Dorothy Mitchell from UW Oshkosh.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dorothy Mitchell, and my research is on the development of a polymer recycling experiment for the undergraduate laboratory. Polymers can often be compared to a necklace of beads on a string. They're formed from single unit monomers, which undergo a polymerization process and form long chain-like structures. These polymers are everywhere around us, and we often use them in our everyday lives with things such as our water bottles, grocery bags, and a major portion of plastic production. Over the past few years, the increase in plastic production has led to recycling issues and waste management issues across the United States. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, only 2.8 million out of the 31 million tons of plastic waste thrown out was recycled in 2015. In order to handle this challenge, we must be able to understand the chemistry of the polymers that make up these plastics. However, most of the traditional undergraduate curriculum focuses on the synthesis and characterization of small, discrete molecules. While these molecules are important, polymers are not included in this. And So our goal is to develop an experiment that will improve polymer chemistry education. We'll be working with the polymer polystyrene, which has the recycling number 6. It's used for styrofoam and many disposable plates and cups. It is one of the harder polymers to recycle due to its low density in foam form and its non-degradable nature. Our methods will follow the industrial process of recycling polystyrene, and it uses the dissolution reprecipitation technique. It begins by dissolving the wasted polystyrene in a natural solvent called p-styrene. Only the polystyrene will be dissolved in this solvent. Any insoluble impurities will need to be filtered out through a filtration process. A weak solvent is then added to precipitate out the pure polystyrene. This pure polystyrene can then be repelletized and reused for new consumer items. Our proposed experiment will follow the same technique. The polystyrene samples will be brought in by the students, and they'll be able to characterize their samples and the product using FTIR spectroscopy, which is an instrument that can be used to determine the bonds in a sample. They'll compare those to the known bonds in polystyrene. At the end of the experiment, students will also be able to make something such as a keychain with their recycled polystyrene. Our expected outcomes for this experiment is to improve polymer learning outcomes. We hope to do this by giving students a pre and post test to see what they know before doing the experiment and what they have learned after the experiment. We also want to encourage better recycling habits and emphasize the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh's commitment to sustainability. Unfortunately, due to the current pandemic, we have not been able to work in the lab. So our future research will include collecting polystyrene samples and testing their solubility in different solvents, such as p-styrene and xylene. We'll also need to figure out a filtration process to remove the impurities and precipitate out the pure polystyrene. As said before, we'll characterize the product using FTIR and intrinsic viscosity. We'll also create a draft of the experiment and finalize it for the organic chemistry lab manual. I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Brent Kajowski, and also Cordelia Bolus and the Robert E. McNair program for funding my research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. That's great. All right, next up we have Gabby Newman from UW Oshkosh.
Hello. My research report, titled Reframing Womanhood, a rhetorical analysis of Ada James's The Womanly Woman, focuses on the life and work of Wisconsin suffragist Ada James. She's remembered as one of the leading figures in the Wisconsin suffrage movement, whose work helped guide the state of Wisconsin into its historic place in suffrage history as the first state in the nation to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. According to the Wisconsin Historical Society, Ada James was born in Richland Center, Wisconsin in 1876 to prominent community members and early women's rights activists Laura Briggs and David G. James, and these two were instrumental in developing her agency for activism and suffrage early on. Later in life, author Genevieve McBride, in a 2005 book titled Women's Wisconsin, From Native Matriarchies to the New Millennium, states that James is best remembered for her vigorous direction of campaigns for suffrage, her relentless appeals for legislative change, and for her leadership roles within some of the most prominent women's organizations of her time. According to author Karen Manners-Smith in her 2000 publication, New Paths to Power, at the time her speech, The Womanly Woman, was written, gender roles for women in society were changing drastically. Women were pursuing careers, higher education, and joining social and political organizations. It was these club women with who James would have been most often associated with, and therefore it can be concluded that they would have also been the target audience of her speech. In formulating my research design, I chose to conduct this report as a feminist rhetorical criticism, which is a qualitative method of research. Communications professor Sonia Foss of the University of Colorado, Denver, states in her 2018 article titled Feminist Criticism that when writing a rhetorical criticism, a critic's primary interests are in the strategies used to disrupt hegemonic structures and that provide alternative ways of thinking, acting, and being. Therefore, when composing my research question, I asked, what rhetorical strategies are available to rhetors who want to challenge hegemonic norms? Using this research question to develop the thesis for my paper, I argued that there are 3 rhetorical strategies available to rhetors who want to challenge hegemonic norms. These are known as reframing, implied we, and ethos. Identifying these 3 rhetorical strategies were the research outcomes of my speech and for what I will analyze in greater detail. To conduct my analysis, my methods predominantly included examination of archival and primary texts, reference to scholarly articles, and the utilization of online historical databases. In my analysis of her use of language in Ada James's speech, The Womanly Woman, I argued that her goal was to change the meaning of womanhood. The first rhetorical strategy she used is known as reframing, which is defined by Sonia Foss, previously cited, as the process of shifting perspectives and involves the selection and interpretation of a new frame for an experience. In her speech, James states that her intentions are to substitute the dominant view of womanhood at the time with a more wholesome one worthy of emulating. To do so, James reframed the notion of womanhood by offering a new perspective on the traditional roles of mother, homemaker, and wife. An example from her speech includes her reframing of women's role as homemaker. James claimed it was a woman's duty to be responsible for the home in which she lived and the city she lived in. Here, James is extending women's roles beyond the traditional barriers of the home and into ones that demand women's participation in society, both in the political and personal spheres. This was a radical notion for womanhood at the time, and thereby challenged dominant ideals surrounding people's understanding of womanhood. James proposed a relatively evocative perspective on the transformation of the dominant beliefs surrounding womanhood. To ensure that her message was impactful, she needed to persuade her audience of the merits of believing and internalizing her message. To accomplish this, James provided additional support for her claim by utilizing the rhetorical strategies of implied we and ethos. According to authors Stuart Smith and Denton in their 2012 publication of Persuasion in Social Movements, the implied we is defined as a subtle means of establishing a feeling of commonality or common ground between the rhetor and the audience. This strategy is effective in blurring the lines of where James was trying to create a relationship with her audience and where she was advancing her own agenda. Examples seen of this in the speech are when James is addressing the need for parental reform. When referring to some of the negative consequences she felt were present in schools in Richland Center, Wisconsin, she referred to these institutions as our schools. Now, whether or not an individual believed that the schools that their children attended also suffered these negative consequences, the use of implied we here transferred the ownership of this belief to her listeners. Finally, to leave lasting impact with her audience, James utilized ethos, or is defined by Foss previously cited, as the appeal of a rhetor's character. This is important because, as stated by authors Crowley and Haughey in their 2004 publication, Ancient Rhetorics for Contemporary Students, an individual's character has as much to do with the audience's perception of their behaviors as it does with their actual behaviors. To engage one's ethos, a rhetor must demonstrate that they are intelligent, are of good moral character, that they have goodwill towards their audience. James accomplished this by referencing the work she herself participated in that supported the claims of what she was saying a womanly woman was supposed to do. James used the content of her speech as a tool to bolster her credibility and demonstrate her intelligence. In doing so, her audience would be able to reference the specific work she herself had completed as an activist, as well as be able to trust that her character was to be trusted. By doing this, James established her ethos while also redefining womanhood. In conclusion, I conducted a feminist rhetorical criticism of Ada James's speech, The Womanly Woman, and I argue that Ada James used her speech to challenge the dominant norms of womanhood by applying the rhetorical strategies of reframing, the implied we, and ethos. I supported my conclusions by referencing how my argument aligns with those of other communication scholars in the field of rhetorical criticism. For example, research conducted by communications professors Lisa Strange from Penn State University and A. Cherry Carlson of Arizona State both discuss how other suffrage activists during this time would appeal to their audience's traditional values and beliefs while also advancing radical appeals for social change. Finally, in consideration of how the study can be utilized for future research. It is my belief that the rhetorical strategies used during the suffrage movement are deserving of future study for their relevance with social justice work engaged in today. Modern rhetors should consider implementing the methods used by suffrage leaders like Ada James, because the suffrage rhetoric serves as a model of success for how to create messages that generate social change. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. That's great. All right, next up, we've got Carolee Rodriguez Jimenez from UW Oshkosh.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, my name is Carolee Rodriguez, and today I will be presenting the research that I did with my mentor, Justina Oślewska, in coding and test interaction in the DRM paradigm. So just a quick little introduction to the DRM paradigm. The DRM paradigm is a method that's used to test false memories using lists of closely related words. So each list is built around a word called a non-presented critical lure. So for example, you can see the words bed, rest, awake, pillow, and blanket, and these could be presented and studied, and then the critical lure for this list would be sleep. And it was discovered in the original study that these critical lures intruded into the participants' memories, and then they would falsely recall them as being studied when their memory was tested. Along with the critical lure, unrelated words and studied words are used when testing the participants' memories. When it comes to recognition tests, there's two common tests. The first is called a yes-no test, and you can see a little example in the right, where horse would be the unrelated word, bed is the studied, and then sleep is the critical lure. And then the other commonly used recognition test is called a two-force choice test. And in this test, instead of having the word singly listed, the words are put into pairs. So you can see another little example using the same words, where horse and bed are a pair, and horse is the unrelated word and bed is the studied, and then sleep would be the critical lure and pillow is the studied word. And then these words, you can see all words from all the lists that the participants study are used, not just from one list. And then for encoding, it's been suggested that memory accuracy actually depends on the depth that experiences, or in this case, words are processed. And this is where deep and shallow encoding come into play. So deep encoding occurs when items are deeply processed, so more associations can be made, and shallow encoding occurs when items are superficially processed and fewer associations are usually made. In the present study, we wanted to explore how deep and shallow encoding interact with different tests in the DRM paradigm, specifically if a two-force choice test promotes more thorough monitoring strategies. If it does, then better performance should be shown when testing shallow encoding on a two-force choice test than a yes-no test. And these findings will hopefully further help us test shallow encoding or discover the mechanisms responsible for memory errors and how memories work. This could even call into question how much we should actually trust our memory and put trust into things like witnesses who believe to remember something, but in reality, their memory has been tainted. And of course, further research, specific research would have to be done for this, but this is a good first step. So for the research design, we used a between subject design, and you can see on the little web diagram the 4 different conditions and then kind of the procedure that the participants went through. So when the participants came in, they were randomly assigned to a condition, and this determined the depth of encoding and then the test that they would take, and after the test, they were debriefed. So before diving into the outcomes, I wanted to define recollection and familiarity. And then there's also a little web diagram. So recollection, these familiarity and recollection are 2 processes that are engaged in recognition memory, and recollection refers to the retrieval of specific information. And this process is considered to be behind the remember judgments because they can vividly recall the experience. And yes, no tests are said to rely on this recollection process more. Whereas familiarity is like a general recognition of something without having the specific details. And this process is considered to be behind the no judgments, or when a person just knows something without being able to recall specific details. And then this forced choice tests are said to rely on this process more. So the findings. our findings were in line with previous research because it was shown that yes, no tests rely more on recollection and 2 forced choice tests rely on familiarity. So we believe that this is why more errors were made on the critical lures than the unrelated items when participants were taking the 2 forced choice tests, because more associations were made. So these lures were recognized as belonging to one of the lists. Another main takeaway is with the encoding. So deep encoding reflects a process that makes it easier to recall specific words. And this is shown because of the increase in number of correctly recognized studied words and a decrease in the errors to the unrelated words. Along with this, a possible shift towards recollection and better distinguishment of words might have occurred while the participants completed a 2 forced choice test. And this is thought to have happened because less critical lures were marked as studied when using the 2 forced choice test than the yes/no test. So this means that the participants did not rely on associations, but they were able to specifically distinguish between a studied and a critical lure, even though they're super similar. And then for shallow encoding, it makes it difficult to access memories of a specific word. So a distinguishment between words, regardless of if they were studied or not, may be impossible, causing fewer errors to lures than the unrelated words, meaning that totally unrelated words, so like horse, were marked as studied. And then before finishing, I just wanted to thank my mentor, Justina Oślewska, who has allowed me to work with her, and then the McNair program for the support and funding that they have given me. Thank you.
So next up, we've got Sydney Schmidt from UW Oshkosh.
Hi, everyone. My research is focused on the factors supporting the outcomes of students with ASD here at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. So a little background on ASD. It is a neurodevelopmental disorder that's characterized by social and communication impairments, as well as restricted or repetitive behaviors. And core features of ASD include both deficits and strengths. The deficits tend to be more well-known and include things like social skills, daily living skills, and age-appropriate levels of independence. And the strengths tend to be less well-known and include things like attention to detail, strong memory, affinity for technology use, and original and creative thoughts. A lot of research has been done on children with ASD, but less is known to date about adult outcomes and the efficacy of adult services for those with ASD. Our research is focused on specifically students in higher education with ASD. There exists built-in services in both K through 12 and higher education. However, access to these services vary. So for example, in K through 12, access is mandated by the need. And in higher education, the student has to take initiative to get access to those services. So in K through 12, there's the built-in special education classroom, case management IEPs, and minor status. And minor status literally means just being under the age of 18 and having someone there to advocate for you and find services for you. And in higher education, you're typically over the age of 18 and you now need to advocate for yourself and find your own services. And also in higher education, these services that you can find are different from those that are available in K through 12. So in higher education, some services that are available are extra exam time, alternate testing site, tutoring, counseling services. But again, you have to advocate for yourself and you have to find them. So the transition between K through 12 and higher education presents a services cliff. And that literally means that there's a level of discrepancy between the services offered. So based on all this information, we designed our study and we came up with 4 different hypotheses. The first one is students with ASD have a significantly lower graduation rate than neurotypical peers. The second is students with ASD have a greater rate of repeating classes that require abstract thought, public speaking, and critical thinking. The third, available campus services are insufficient in attending to the needs of students with ASD based on student outcomes. And the fourth, home life and parent intervention provide a structure that dorm life cannot. Therefore, those with ASD that reside at home are more likely to have better retention and graduation rates. Advanced slide. Our design and sample, we got de-identified data through the UW Oshkosh Accessibility Center, and data was provided for 19 undergraduate students and 1 graduate student. Data was collected for 6 years from fall of 2014 to spring of 2020, and we used a quantitative approach and looked at both descriptive statistics and correlations in SPSS. We were able to look at 18 variables that fell into 4 broad categories. They included academic success, non-academic success, like if they opened any conduct cases, demographic information, like if they were local or non-local, if the student was a transfer student, and then graduation progress. So our results, hypotheses 1 and 3, are inconclusive due to the sample size as well as lack of knowledge about either where the students went and if they continued their education, or if they seeked out external supports outside of Oshkosh. And then hypotheses 2 and 4 are not supported. Specifically, hypothesis 2, we were only able to look at 1 class that fell into the abstract thinking requirement, and only 1 student ended up failing. But we do, however, have an unexpected finding, is that the students with ASD who transferred to UW Oshkosh had a significantly higher graduation rate. It has a high correlation with a magnitude of 0.65 and a p-value of less than 0.05. This is significant because not only is there a gap in research on students with ASD in higher education, but no one has systematically examined what role the transfer status plays on this outcome, or plays on the outcomes of this population. While on one hand, these results may not transfer outside of this study, on the other hand, these may suggest that students with ASD are more likely to persist in their higher education. Our limitations and implications. The data from spring of 2020 may be an outlier due to the COVID-19 pandemic and classes going fully online. The data did not include information about seeking out services external to Oshkosh, as well as the data did not include demographic information such as age, race, gender, anything like that. The sample is just made up of students with ASD that was referred to the dean's office, and they're typically non-voluntary referrals. The data gathered represents a group with fewer comorbidities, conduct cases, and less need to be followed by the dean's office, which potentially indicates high-functioning ASD. Future studies should focus on larger sample sizes across multiple institution types in higher education. Students with ASD should be tracked over the full scope of their post-secondary education, and a variety of identifying factors should be considered. I'd like to acknowledge Kirsten from the UW Oshkosh Dean of Students Office, who was the source of our data. Dr. Aggie Haney was my mentor, and the UW Oshkosh McNair program. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sydney. That's great. All right, next up we have Jessica Smith from UW Superior.
Hello, my name is Jessica Smith, and I'm a legal studies student at the University of Wisconsin-Superior. And my research this summer is on missing and murdered Indigenous people, a healing journey of raising survivor and grassroots warrior voices. I am a survivor of domestic abuse, sexual assault, and sex trafficking, and all 3 directly correlate with the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people. And this is kind of just a really quick background on some of the underlying issues that relate to why so many Indigenous people are going missing and getting murdered. The main thing that I want to touch on is historical and multi-generational trauma. Historical trauma is trauma that is experienced by a specific group of people, like the violent colonization of Native Americans. The effects of historical trauma still affect Native people today. It contributes to the MMIP epidemic. My current study, I used mixed methods. I surveyed 35 Indigenous people across the country and in Canada, and I did qualitative interviews with 12 people from different aspects of work across the country as well. And the survey results, I asked people, if they were abused, and 29% said yes, they were abused sexually as a child, and 38% said they were abused emotionally as a child. And only 50% of the victims had reported the crimes that were against them. And I also asked if they knew the person that victimized them or if the person was a stranger, family member, and the majority, the higher amount was 44% of people that were victimized by their intimate partner. When I asked what grooming was, 90% of the people said yes and 10% said no. And what grooming is it's really the trickery and lies that is involved when girls and women are getting tricked into sex trafficking. Oftentimes, the trafficker makes their victim think that there's a romantic relationship, that there's a lot of promises, fake promises and lies, and then they end up getting sex trafficked. So what I did with this study was I took the needs that I found within my survey data, and I turned around and I followed up with qualitative interviews with people that are providing services. And one of the main things that I'd like to touch on in this part here is that a lot of the people really feel more comfortable with culturally informed services. And there is a lack of culturally informed services that are available for survivors of sex trafficking, violence, really even drug treatment. There's a lack of culturally based services. So I really wanted to introduce people to people that have connections, people that are providing these services, taking the quantitative data from the survey and meeting those needs that I found within the same report. And this is a list of the people that I featured within my report. And the report is 50 pages long. So every single person on this list here is really detailed in their work, the services that they provide. Anita Lucchese is the founder of Sovereign Bodies Institute, and she created the database for missing and murdered Indigenous people because no government entity has ever undertaken such effort. Indigenous people are completely invisible in government systems, and a lot of cities don't even have systems in place that have a category for Native American people. So when Anita created the database she was trying to work on her thesis, and she needed a number of missing people, and there wasn't one to be found. So she created it herself. And now it's become her life's work, and there's over 4,200 cases logged in that database. Also, Lenny Hayes is a two-spirit national advocate for violence against men and boys. And when people hear MMIW, they think that it's just women that are going missing and getting hurt, when really it's all Native people. So I really wanted to feature Lenny's work as well because nobody ever created this space for him to heal. So he started his own private practice to create that space for men and boys. The time was really limited with this study because I'm doing it for the McNair Scholar Program, and they are the ones who funded the research, but I didn't have enough time to really interview all the people that I wanted to do, so I'm going to do a continuation of this study, and I'm releasing the report at the end of probably within a month or so. Sovereign Bodies Institute's website and my personal research website are listed there for anybody that wants to read the report. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Jessica. That's really great. All right, I'd like to please welcome our final presenter, Caitlin Timmons from UW-Platteville.
Okay, hi. So I'm Caitlin Timmons, and my research project is protecting the planets from microbial contamination, removing and isolating microbes using first contact polymer. So the big question everyone wants to know is there life on other planets? In order to discover this mystery, we need to limit microbial contamination. This can occur both forward and backwards. Forward means that our telescopes would be infected with bacteria and would be traveling to a planet of interest, infecting that planet. Backwards would be that planet would contain its own bacteria that could travel back on our telescopes that could potentially infect Earth. So NASA's Planetary Protection Division is tasked with protecting Earth and other bodies from foreign contamination such as bacteria. Bacteria can survive in extreme conditions such as extreme temperature ranges, high humidity, and the vacuum of space. Bacteriospores are also highly hydrophobic and can adhere tightly to surfaces, which make them extremely hard to remove. So our research project uses first contact, which is an adhesive polymer demonstrated to clean telescope lenses at an atomic scale. It is in development with NASA to clean the Starshade, which is their newest spacecraft designed to block light of nearby stars to observe orbiting exoplanets. Our research goal was to develop methods that capture and isolate microbes by taking advantage of the unique adhesive properties of the first contact polymer. So our research design was a two-pronged approach. The first area was the removal assay, which we planted a volume of bacteria on a slide. Typically, we focus on glass for this first project. We let the bacteria dry, and then we added the first contact, which goes on like a liquid glue and then dries as glue does, so you can peel it off. So once that was dried, we peeled it off and placed it into a tube for the isolation assay to be set aside later. Then we used a soy trypticase broth to resuspend that bacteria, or resuspend that area where that bacteria was originally placed, and it was placed in a test tube where it was heat shocked and then plated overnight to grow. The isolation assay, we used that first contact from the removal assay, placed that into a test tube, heat shocked, and then added first contact solvent to dissolve that dried first contact, and then it was plated to grow. So the results in the reduction assay, this shows the glass. So that big area that you see is the glass that was just bacteria on glass and then resuspended. So you can see that there's obvious growth and that the resuspension works to obtain bacteria from a glass slide. Then the first contact shows the glass after it was cleaned with first contact. So after about 8 trials, there was still some area that did have some, but it still shows a 99.1% reduction rate using first contact. And then with the isolation assay, that chart, the control was just plating the bacteria from a test tube. And then the first contact was isolating that bacteria from the dried first contact. And that is about like an 81% isolation rate. So that shows that like we can obtain bacteria from dried first contact. So in conclusion, first contact does remove bacterial spores from multiple surfaces. These spores are very difficult though to remove from surfaces. Bacterial spores can also be isolated from the first contact, and first contact can also remove DNA, suggesting a use in forensic evidence recovery. So the other conclusions do show that we can reduce the bacteria before a telescope goes into space, and we would be able to isolate bacteria from a telescope if we were to find life on another planet. Our future work would be to expand the reduction and isolation assay to additional surfaces like the NASA recommended surfaces such as titanium and stainless steel. We would like to test NASA provided bacterial and fungal strains isolated from returning spacecrafts, and then use surfactants to reduce the surface tension between first contact and a surface, as well as perform DNA assays. And then for acknowledgements, I would like to thank Photonic Cleaning Technologies and NASA's Office of Planetary Protection for sponsoring this research, as well as James Hamilton, who invented first contact, and then Mark Levenstein, who was our advisor on the biology side of this. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Caitlin. All right. All right, so a big round of applause, virtual applause for our presenters. I think really a great showcase today of research and innovation from across the system. And you know, it was really great to see such a diverse set of projects from the humanities, the arts, the sciences, as well as business. So really thank you again, presenters, for being here today. Really applaud you for taking the time, and thanks again for our mentors as well. As a reminder, students presenting today are competing for cash prizes. The winners of the competition will be announced via social media next week. And on this note, I would like to once again thank our prize sponsor at Wolf Fredrickson for their generous support. This event really could not be made possible without you, so thanks again for that.